Hello, I am taking on a challenge to beat every playable Nintendo-published game. The next game is Track and Field. This one is the final third-party Play Choice 10 game from 1987 that I'm looking at. Track and Field was another Konami-developed NES title, and, like many of the Play Choice 10 games so far, this one was basically an arcade game to begin with. I say basically because it was actually a combination of two different arcade games. They were both Konami machines, and the first game was also called Track and Field in the US. This machine was inspired by the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, and the devs really wanted to make a game that allowed players to compete against each other. The arcade game launched in Japan in 1983 under the name Hyper Olympic. It was released internationally the next year, and in the US, its name was changed to Track and Field due to the fact that a different video game company, Atari, was an official sponsor of the LA Olympics. The game ended up being a massive success for Konami. Track and Field topped the charts all over the world, and in 1990, the president of Konami even regarded it as the most successful game Konami ever made. Apparently, they held an international competition for Track and Field that attracted over 1 million players, which, at least by 2016, was regarded as the largest organized video game competition in history. Considering the success of the arcade machine, it should come as no surprise that the game was eventually ported to the Famicom. This port was the first game that was worked on by Kazuhisa Hashimoto, the man who made the Konami code. He said that only 2 people worked on it, and it only took 6 months to make. They even made special controllers for the game since they had received complaints about the game hurting people's hands on the standard controller. Now, this version of the game isn't exactly what made it to the US. In the arcades, Track and Field eventually got a sequel called Hypersports, and similarly, Hypersports got a Famicom port in Japan. Now, the NES release of Track and Field is actually a combination of both Hyper Olympic and Hypersports, including a selection of modes from both games. I couldn't really find any information on how well the NES game sold, but eventually it was ported back to the arcades through the Play Choice 10, where Nintendo published and sold the game themselves. Because this was the version that Nintendo sold, it was the Play Choice 10 version that I ended up playing for the challenge. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's jump into my time with Track and Field. The title screen features an athlete running with a torch for the Olympic torch relay as the Chariots of Fire theme plays in the background. So, the way this game works is that there are 8 different Olympic-themed mini-games, and as long as you score high enough in each one, you'll move on to the next game. I was able to start at whatever mini-game I wanted, so I started with the 100-meter dash. At the top of the screen, we can see all kinds of stats. The main things that matter here are my current score on the top left, which is the combined total across all games, the time needed to qualify for the next game, and my actual time for the current attempt. There are 2 runners here, and I am on the bottom and the CPU is on the top. The CPU doesn't actually matter a whole lot since the main goal of the single-player mode is to keep qualifying and to rack up a high score. The 100-meter dash is basically a test to see how fast you can mash the A button. On my first attempt, I was mashing the B button rather than the A button, and I went absolutely nowhere for the first few seconds. I eventually figured out what I was doing wrong, but it was too late. I missed the qualification time by 35 milliseconds. I think the CPU speed actually adapts to whatever your speed is in this one, because he didn't qualify either. Both of our characters stood there and wept at the humiliation of losing the very first game. This booted me back to the title screen, but since I ended up being pretty close to qualifying despite my awful start, I knew I should be able to make it if I tried again. On my next attempt, I still had a bit of trouble starting at the right time, but I did much better. I reached the goal in 11 seconds, easily qualifying for the next event. Up next was the long jump. This one has you mashing the A button a bunch again, but this time you have to press the up button as close to the white line as possible. Once you jump, the amount of time you hold down the button affects the angle of your jump. Once again, I didn't know what I was doing at first, and I ended up face planting into the sand. Thankfully, the long jump gives you 3 attempts, and only the best of 3 is used to see if you qualify. I jumped 7.94 meters, which was more than enough to move on. After this was the hurdles. To no surprise, I was mashing A once again with this one, although I had to occasionally press up to jump over each hurdle. I did pretty good on my first try. I was just shy of the world record, and I crushed the time needed to qualify. Up next was the javelin throw, and this was a lot like the long jump. Similar to that one, the amount of time I held down the up button affected the angle of my shot. I mistimed my first throw, went too high on my second throw, and went too low on my third throw, resulting in me just barely not qualifying for the next event. Darn, there goes my streak. This game is basically an endless high score chaser, and it loops back around once you finish all the games. So, while you can go on forever, I think I want my main goal to be beating every game in a row at least once, and maybe even beating that high score too. I obviously failed that here, but I decided it would probably be best to just continue where I left off to get better at each of the games before going for a full loop. On my next try, I finally figured out a good angle, and I crushed the qualifying score. Up next was skeet shooting. This confused me a bit at first, but it's actually pretty simple. There are two cursors on the screen that auto-track the nearest clay pigeon. All you have to do is either push A to shoot at the right cursor or up on the control stick to shoot at the left one. Basically, this one is all about timing. It's pretty fast-paced, and this was probably my favorite of all the games. Similar to the long jump, you do 3 rounds and you use your best of the 3. I beat the qualification score on my first try and moved on to the next event. This one was the triple jump. Unsurprisingly, it was a lot like the long jump, just with 3 jumps instead of 1. I kept messing up the timing, and getting the right angles for jumps was kind of tough. I just barely qualified on my 3rd try after failing the timing on the initial jump twice in a row. Up next was archery. This one was a bit more complicated than it might first appear. There's a moving target, wind that curves your shot, and the amount of time you hold down the fire button affects the vertical position of your shot. This results in some pretty tricky timing since you have to account for the wind, the moving target, and the amount of time you need to hold down the fire button. At first, I didn't really understand the controls at all, and I did terribly. I finally started to get it by my 3rd try, but I still didn't quite do good enough to qualify. I was close though, so I decided to just move on to the last game, the high jump. This one was the hardest one for me to figure out. Apparently, the manual even knows this, as it says that the high jump separates the men from the boys. What makes it tricky is that you need to adjust your jump multiple times in midair, and it kind of took me some time to figure out how to do this properly. Man, I failed this one a lot. The qualifying height is simply just the position of the bar, so the only goal is to get over it, but I just could not make it over the bar no matter what I tried. I failed again and again and again until finally I had an attempt where I managed to get over the bar. Well, since this was so hard for me to get right, I decided to make this attempt my run where I would go for a full loop. You can start at any game you want, so I guess this attempt just will start at the high jump instead of the 100-meter dash. Speaking of, I beat the 100-meter dash with ease, but at the end, some sort of strange creature walked by in the background. This thing gave me a bunch of extra points. Kind of random, but I'll take it. There's actually a ton of secret bonuses like this in the game, and you have to meet certain conditions in each event to see them. Apparently, I got the bonus here because my time was equal to the CPU time. Anyway, after this, I proceeded to beat the long jump with little effort, although I kind of failed spectacularly at the hurdles. Hitting one of them causes your character to totally faceplant, and it happened to me twice. Darn, I already failed to qualify. Well, the high jump still seemed like the hardest one, so I decided to just start there again. It was a bit close, but I qualified for the high jump on my last try. Overall, this attempt went a lot better. I even crushed the world record during the skeet shooting game. This caused me to earn enough points to beat the default high score. Nice, that's one of my goals completed. In the archery game, I got a perfect bullseye, which made another one of those bonuses appear. I had to shoot an apple on top of a cat or something. I nailed it and got a ton of points, as well as some extra arrows. Because of this, I crushed the archery game and finished a full loop. With that, my second goal was complete. The game loops back to the first minigame after this, so up next was the difficult high jump again. This time, the qualifying number was even higher. You see, each time you finish a loop, the qualifying scores are increased, so you have to earn better and better scores in each game to keep the run alive. I was satisfied with just completing a single loop, but I decided to see how far I could take the run. To my surprise, I actually beat the high jump, and I moved on. I kept going too, and on my next run through the skeet shooting game, I even managed to score a perfect game, which caused another one of those bonuses to appear. This one was a UFO that I had to shoot down, but I wasn't ready for it and I just let it fly by. Whoops. I made it all the way through the archery game again, so that means I managed to finish a full second loop. Nice. In loop 3, the one that finally did me in was not the high jump, but actually the triple jump. My run ended with a score of 226,570. With both of my goals complete, I was happy with my time with the game, but I wanted to see a few more of those bonuses. Unfortunately, it was kind of tricky to find out how to get them all, as I think most places online just talked about how to unlock them in the arcade versions. I did at least end up hitting the UFO in the skeet shooting game though. The only other one I could figure out was the high jump. By clearing the bar all 3 times, a random astronaut flew in with a jetpack. With that, my time with track and field was complete. On to the review. Well, sorry to anyone who might have fond memories of this game in the arcades, but track and field is just not for me. Now, I don't know if the arcade versions are notably better or anything, but I'm just not all that into multi-sport event games like this. A lot of the mini-games are just too one-note for me to get all that into them. It's not terrible or anything, but it's not something I find particularly engaging either. The amount of minigames is nice, I guess, but unfortunately most of them are just slight variations of the same ideas. With a few exceptions, these mostly just come down to mashing A and pressing up for a specific amount of time to get a perfect angle. I guess the fun for people comes in the form of mastering these games and getting near perfect scores, but I personally just got bored too quickly with them to have any interest in returning to the events and pushing for higher scores. It's made well enough, but it just wasn't able to keep my interest for long. I gave the game a 5 out of 10. With Track and Field complete, I have now finished 66 out of the 155 NES games in the challenge, meaning I am now 42.48% of the way through all of the NES games. Hold on, the total number of NES games changed again. Well, that's because I decided to add all of the NES collections to the challenge. Originally, I considered them to be unchanged ports, sort of similar to something on the Virtual Console, so I didn't think they qualified as a unique release. However, it was too difficult for me to determine what would count as enough of a change with collections like these, so I decided to just include them all for the sake of being thorough. I plan on doing just a single video on all of the NES collections, so they shouldn't actually extend the time of the challenge by a whole lot. Anyway, thanks for watching the video. If you want to see more of these in the future, make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss out on the next one. Also, leave a like if you enjoyed it, since it will help the channel grow and motivate me to continue this series. I hope I will see you in the next step of my quest to beat every Nintendo game.